start.
Thank you so much. It's all over to me. Thank you everybody for being here. I have some notes. I've got to say, you're a freaking intimidating audience because, you know, from an international perspective, I'm a lecturer in architecture. This is like ground zero for architecture that's really cool and progressive. And it's also the world's leading nation for cycling. So how does someone from Australia come and speak to your audience? I feel like this guy on the right coming to Australia to speak to us about surfing, all right? So just remember, I am an okay surfer. I grew up in the surf. It's natural to me. Everything you might want to say about cycling, I'm all over it with the surfing, okay? So, but of course, that's the way I cycle in Australia, like, fighting buses and things. So, I'm not entirely sure why I put these images up, but you know, I'm used to diving into waters like the ones on the left and not the ones on the right. And when I look out my kitchen window of the house I'm selling at the moment, you know, we get bored with the bikini girls surfing and things, whereas it's obviously a pretty exciting thing when it happens in Amsterdam for some people. Okay, so appreciate that. I at least know something. I know about surfing, and I guess if someone came to Australia talking about surfing, I'd think, right, well, you're passionate at least. Okay, if you're a Dutch person and you cycle. Now, I'll put this up as kind of like a straw man argument. You know, I'm going to say what's stopping us as a planet from having a bimodal share of 87% in every single city of the world. And that's the way I want to frame this. Why do I say 87%? Because that's the car modal share in America, and we call that a nation of drivers. You know, in the Netherlands, people like to call this a nation of cyclists, but you're only at 27%. You need to up that, at least to where China was, you know, reportedly 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So what do I want to achieve? What, where, when, and why, blah, blah, blah. So we want a bimodal share of 87%. We would like it by 2030. Why? A couple of decades. It took architects, through their visionary powers and persuasive powers, a couple of decades to get people really excited about driving. Okay? So it seems to be there as a possibility for the architectural and urban design community. Where do we want it? The whole world, why not? Why do we want it? For public health. There are lots of different public health studies, all-cause mortality studies that say you'll live 7 years longer, 5 years longer, whatever. I really like this one by a colleague of mine at the Harvard School of Public Health. She found that menopausal women, the best predictor of them controlling their weight through menopause is that they regularly cycle. Okay? I think that's an interesting sort of way, something that we can all relate to. Regular cycling, because I got the love handle happening, you know. We all feel it, don't we? You know, unless you're rake thin for whatever reason. And how are we going to do it? However the hell architects and planners did it with cars when they started about a century ago on their quest. So we start with polemicists, and I'm the polemicist. People like Marinetti, Senelia, who come out and say, just trash the city as it is, that real polemical sort of language. All right, we want to embrace the beauty of speed, the victory of Samothrace, if you've read the Futurist Manifesto recently. But it really said, to hell with everything else, we're going for it with cars. All right, and it set that sort of thing. And then Senelia came along with these visions, these projects. Naively, what might this look like if we do it? A few years later, we get our hero, Le Corbusier. And he comes along and naively, you know, there are some glitches in it, but he says we want to do supercar architecture. So they haven't even got freeways yet. Freeways are going to be decades off, but cars are going to be spinning in off of these freeways, and kind of an extension of the cloverleaf pattern, they'll spin into the house. You know, the car could have pulled up beside the house, but Le Corbusier brings the car in, and as there was the fashion then, all these architects went around with their cars, in Corb's case, Avoy's, and photographing it in front of their house to let the bourgeois know this is the way of the future. This is what we want you to embrace. I like this guy, Bjarke Ingels, because he's kind of the Le Corbusier of the bicycling age. He's there at the vanguard, and he does a building that is over the top with bicycling. He could have had the bicycles that are rented out at this thing in Shanghai, he could have had those down on the ground, but he puts them up on the roof to make you have to ride up and ride all the way down to do a super bicycling building, kind of as a propaganda message, or at least a prophetic message of what things might look like. And he's not the only one. I think the first one by accident was here in Rotterdam, the Cube House, you know, a building that you can ride your bike up and through. You know, architects, I think, should start guessing at what, you know, give people a vision of the good life that's completely bicycle enabled. You know, 8 House is a great apartment building. It's got progenitors in buildings like Bellevue City that weren't built. So people have been thinking about these complete bike access buildings where you ride all the way to your apartment. The one in Copenhagen, unfortunately, has kind of been undone, I think, by some litigation worries. There are some signs up that you shouldn't cycle. Okay, Le Corbusier is a great example. He teams up with Gabriel Voisin, they're mates, he makes cars, Voisin does. Voisin sponsors him for a plan. What would Paris look like if it's just all auto-centric with cars whizzing along freeways underneath? He does the plan for Rio, he photographs buildings in front of cars in front of buildings, and he designs his own car. Like, what else could you possibly do? You know, he's a car nut. And this is well before cars are mainstream. He's doing this to try and, you know, to bring people into it. And Bjarke Ingels, interestingly, does all the same things. He's paired up with Jens Martin Skibsted, who designs designer bikes. He's always seen with these Biomega brand bikes. He sort of uses it to bike wash himself when he turns up to events. He designs this sort of building. He's kind of like the Le Corbusier. And he's a great example. He's not on his own. Like my book, I go through and I sort of, you know, spot this trend. Architects who design bikes kind of like the Rietveld chair, you know, to show people, you know, this is what I do as a designer, but I'm doing it through a bike rather than as a chair. The Ron Arad bike's classic because it's got metal wheels, it skids out, you can't even ride the thing. And I think as architects, this is what we quite often do, is we compromise utility to a point to foreground meaning. We bring meaning to the fore. That's what an artwork is. It's purely about meaning, not about function whatsoever. So, you know, the architecture world thinks this way and drags bikes into that way of thinking. West 8, you know, the Rotterdam landscape architects, don't know if anyone's here, but they did this brilliant project in New York where everyone would have these wooden bikes tossed around the whole island. They're kind of like chairs or part of the landscape architecture. They are part of the architecture, these bikes that you pick up and fly as though they're birds. You know? So these are architects designing bikes and just doing what Korb did. You know, this is what I think is one step in the way. I'm scratching my head about this one really. I toss it around in the book a little bit, but I like the idea that architects might be inspired by bikes. I think there's often cross-fertilisation. You know, bike designers are inspired by architecture and vice versa. I sort of track these trends. But, you know, how do we put together a building in the way that you might put a bike together? That was what Korb was trying to do with the Citroën house. How do you build a building like a car? Oh, let's get the hell out of here. That's not a joke, is it? In Australia, that means run. Is this on my 20 minutes, moderator? Let me have a sip of wine while we're waiting. Okay. I presume we didn't have to run. Okay, then I think we should start thinking about urban morphology, how we plan our city. Le Corbusier, way back, thought we'd have towers in the park, and they realised that would create this indefensible space at the ground plane, so Le Corbusier on the far left. The reaction to that, the backlash, was to say, well, let's do a completely pedestrianised city, and then you've got this problem of defensible space with pedestrians who are hard to spread around. They just want to stay on the main commercial streets. So there's this sort of paranoia about the unpatrolled street that underpins this revival of European-style architecture. Now, bicycles, because we have this sort of omniscient presence on the street. You know, if you're on a street, say anywhere in the Netherlands, I think you know that if you're being mugged, well, a bike could come along. You know, they come along quickly, and there's not that same paranoia. And I think along with that, we lose a lot of the strictures that have driven classic urban design thinking that's really around this whole issue of surveillance of the street or putting eyes on the street. I think there are a lot of things that we can do. We can loosen right up and pretty much have an anything goes urban morphology. All right, where will we actually do this? Like, what's our playground? In the car age, that was the edge of the city's suburban sprawl, and that's where people went. I think it's pretty clear to me that our playground, where we can examine the whole possibility of a hyper-bicycle city, is in these former industrial areas that no one quite knows what to do with. These are the parts of the city that people are coming back and using classic urban design theory and trying to recreate the European city. If you noticed, after the last building boom, they were all built with buildings much bigger than the master plans of the 80s and 90s suggested. They were built with large pension fund sort of buildings, which create sort of vacuous spaces in between and don't do all of those beautiful walkable cities that people wanted to achieve. And it gives us kind of like a place where we can do architecture. It's a space that's uncontested by drivers. Other people don't really want it. It's free space for us. And there's also a space that nobody else really wants apart from cyclists. In the Netherlands, where cyclists have the whole of the city to play with, they've got better options. This is really driven home. You see in a Dutch city that the wharves, the docklands, are kind of, well, why the hell would you go there? In where I'm from, the docklands at least have cyclists because they've got nowhere else. The rest of the city is so congested with cars that we all sort of hug the waterfront. You see that in New York in particular. They were sort of designed, or master planned at least, in the wake of radical theorists who were reacting against the car city. Guy Debord in particular, the situationist in France, who said, to hell with machines taking over the city, we're just going to get drunk and walk and feel our city. Jane Jacobs comes along not long after that, and she says cars are ruining the city, we want to have, you know, walkable neighbourhoods. And then people like Gordon Cullen come along. And so we get these master plans. Gordon Cullen is like one of the leaders of this style of thinking. He gets a large industrial area that's, you know, past its industrial function. He master plans it to really be like Venice or one of these medieval cities. And then when you see the figure ground plan as it's actually emerged, it's actually far more, you know, it's not at all like Venice. You know, you can't compare it with the figure ground plan of Rome. So it didn't really work out as a walkable city. There's a couple of reasons for this. One is that after the Garden Cities movement, you know, we internalise the idea that we want gardens and vegetation and light and space. You know, we want this sort of thing. We don't really want to buy an apartment that's only got a 2-metre outlook to its neighbour. So we can't really do the medieval walkable city anymore. The other thing that's happening in these kinds of spaces, this is Singapore on the left that I know really well. I don't know Bilbao at all, but in these urban redevelopment areas, we're seeing, you know, iconic architecture and large apartment buildings, pension fund architecture. I think we're actually seeing a kind of architecture just by default that is conducive to the bicycle-born point of view. And I didn't recognise your uniforms here. So I think I see it as just a kind of a happy accident that in these sorts of sites we're seeing a sort of an architecture that's too big and spread out to really be appreciated as a pedestrian. Cars, quite rightly, are shut off from these areas, and where I'm from in particular, cyclists move in like hermit crabs and fill in the void, and we need that space. It's the only space that we've got in the city to really move. And we find a kind of an architecture that appeals to us at our speed. It's not like you know, if you walk along the waterfront here as a pedestrian, your eyes are filled with something new about every 5 minutes, and it's as boring as all hell. But when you're on a bike, it unfolds at a nice speed, the speed that the medieval city used to unfold to you when you walked along it because it was fine-grained. So I, as someone who's really committed to cycling, I like this. You know, it's a disaster if you're into pedestrianism. But Yeah, there are some faults with pedestrianism, and that's why cycling's really taking off. You know, but walking, there are a couple of faults with walking. You know, you can't just walk to where you work. Every person in the household is not going to live in the ideal location that's walking distance to all your schools and all your workplaces. You're going to need to fill in the gap somehow. And that's why, one of the main reasons that cycling is really taking off. And it's taking off in these kinds of brownfield areas. Like, there's a network of greenways in Minneapolis that really once was a network of train lines and waterfronts and barge routes that brought commodities to factories to be turned into other things. And it's being turned into a network of greenways and second best American cycling city. With bike paths in all the wrong places. They go to all the places you don't want to go, but there's a way around that, that if you're a committed cyclist, and in these countries, you know, where I'm from, cycling's not an everyday thing, it's just something that you do if you give a shit. If you really care, you get on your bike, actually sell your house and you buy one next to one of these greenways, and this one's being rezoned either side of it to allow new, what I call bicycle-oriented development. So people who care can shift toward it, and that's kind of the way things are panning out. Bicycle advocates, especially ones who come here and are really completely enamoured by Dutch cycling, you know, really want, God, we want to do this, I want to do this. You know, on the left, I want to put cycle tracks in everywhere. But the voters don't want it. Even the police neutralise the bicycle paths. It's ruined and it's not properly policed. It'll be intergenerational. I'll be an old man or dead before this is really working in my country. Right now I need a shortcut and I'm looking for what's actually happening. And that is that recreational groups, they're dismissed as, are being put in places wherever they can be put in, which is where, you know, bulk haulage used to happen. And then people are crossing the city, getting onto that safe bit, going along and then backing into the bit that they want to be in. We're not seeing this. It'll be, you know, in my lifetime I'll never see bicycle tracks go into car-dependent areas, hilltop suburbs and things like that. And I think too, it'll be 20 years at least before even progressive cities like Paris have got non-neutralised bike tracks going along Main Street, and we can really have what we ultimately want. In the meantime, we need the shortcut, and that's what I'm interested in. Because actually, you know, there's a bit of competition here. I'd really like to see Australia win this race. Okay. So we're relocating to this new kind of space that I think is quite likeable to queer space. This guy, Urabn wrote a really interesting book that said there's a kind of space that if you're not a member of the homosexual community, you don't see it. And cyclists, we're kind of marginalised and persecuted as well. You know, we're killed far more often than gays are in my country, you know, by cars, people who really hate us. And so we are likewise seeking out this marginal space where we can thrive, and that's what I call cycle space. And it's different for everyone, it's phenomenologically different from everyone. And I've got about 50 million different slides there, how I map it out in different cities like Singapore, I'm looking at the moment, New York, how the hell you do it in a country where people think bike transport is transporting bikes on the back of the car. That's where I live at the moment, but it's paradise for this stuff, you know, the bike racing. So, anyway, and one little passing thing, because I've only got 2 minutes and I should shut the hell up, you know, I've got tons more slides. What do you do here in the Netherlands, okay? Far be it for me to tell you how to run a country when you're the best already, right? But you have actually what I'd call transit-oriented development complicated by bicycles. In other words, you've got these trains that take you too far to work. 100 kilometres is just ridiculous. You shouldn't commute from here to Amsterdam to work. You know, what country can ever offer that to people? That seems ridiculous. And so then you create this problem of hypercongestion in the city where everyone, instead of just riding to their blinking destination 10 kilometres away, 15 kilometres away, are riding and crushing into a train station that's really made just for people who walk there with bikes to take another trip. All this mode change stuff, you know. I really think you need like bicycling highways and a neutral field where people just cycle and leave out the train as much as they possibly can. And, you know, something radical just to toss in the mix. Just get rid of the train stations, you know, damage them. Cause some mischief with them. Get rid of all the intermediate stops. Just have the big ones for holidays or something like that. Thank you so much, moderator.